Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Mohammed Ijaz, and I'm chairing Institute of Corrosion Aberdeen branch this year. And we are very thankful to Kevin to present today's talk. I would introduce CJ Engerin, who is Vice Chair of Institute of Corrosion Aberdeen branch, who will take over for our presentation for tonight. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Jess. Good evening, everyone. Hope you've all had a lovely day today. My name is CG Anjorin. I'm the current Vice Chair for the Institute of Corrosion Aberdeen branch. And today we have a talk by Dr. Kevin MacDonald in a few minutes. I would just like to introduce you to the Aberdeen branch. So, the Aberdeen branch, once this slide start moving, is in front of us. Our current branch committee are in the photograph. Most of us, we do have a couple of gentle fellows who have relocated, but this is about the bulk of us, for want of a better expression. We do have the companies listed in front of us currently as our branch sponsors. I would like to say thank you to them for their kind support, especially during this technical year. If we have any companies which are interested in being branch sponsors, please contact us by email or drop us a DM, and we'll get back to you to discuss how you can become a branch sponsor for the Aberdeen branch of the Institute of Corrosion. This is a summary of our technical program for this technical year so far, the 2022-23 technical year. We've had talks so far on pipelines, a variety of topics, to be honest. A very interesting talk by Dr. Praful Sharma in November last year, followed by our YP event, which we had the grand finale. And in January, we had a talk by Roland Anderson of Access Corrosion. In February, we had a talk by Mr. Raza Amin of Anka Consulting on the enterprise digital solutions for asset integrity management. And today, we are fortunate enough to have with us Dr. Kevin MacDonald, who will be giving us a talk on effective pipework analysis and inspection planning using digital twins. We also have these programs lined up for the rest of this technical year, and you can get the details on our ICorr Aberdeen website and on the ICorr HQ website as well. So, our talk today is by Dr. Kevin MacDonald. He's the Principal Integrity Engineer at Sonomatic. He's a mathematician with a PhD in computing science from the University of Aberdeen and has extensive experience in data analytics and inspection planning for pipe. One second, please. Pipework and pressure vessels and pipelines, co-authoring the recommended practice for non-intrusive inspection as applied to pressure vessels. As well as integrity consultancy, Kevin is involved in the technical capability development for Sonomatic's integrity team with a focus on statistical approaches. Recently, he has been involved in developing a statistically based method of inspection, planning, and evaluation applied to subsea pipelines for a major operator. So without much ado, over to you, Kevin. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. And I'll start sharing mine. Oh, a sneak preview there halfway through. Yeah, thank you. As I say, as CJ says, I'll be discussing effective pipework analysis and inspection planning using digital twins. It's mostly centered around oil and gas applications, but the principles could be applied more generally beyond that. But before I get into that, I'm just going to do a brief introduction on Sonomatic more generally for anyone who doesn't know. So Sonomatic began life really in the 1980s to come out of the nuclear inspection industry and applied techniques to the oil and gas industry. And where still are seen as very much a specialist inspection company. Approximately 5 years ago, we started developing a more conventional division to go after term contracts and things like that, and also just do more mainstream integrity inspection around spool testing, things of that nature. Our current owners have started to acquire other companies under the banner of the CWL group, and it's very much complementary inspection companies who offer services that can be sort of combined on a sister company basis, essentially, to just to enhance what we offer. For example, there's the banner or tree is shown on the screen here. So they've got Vertec Group and Geoceans, who are mainly based in Australia. They do conventional UT and ROV deployment. AUAV are a drone company, and there's a number of other companies under this banner too, which offer, as I say, offer very complementary inspection services to what each other do. This slide is slightly out of date. We also acquired an inspection towards the end of last year, and yeah, they'll now be starting to be incorporated into the CWL group as well. In terms of Sonomatic integrity services, as CJ says, I work in the integrity division within Sonomatic. So there are three sort of main sub-teams within that division. So there's integrity, which I work in. I'd say there's a software division, which mainly produces software for use in-house, but we are now starting to branch out into licensing software more externally. And an R&D division, which centers around a number of things, such as development of new techniques primarily, alongside some software aspects too. So in terms of the integrity services that we offer, it's mainly around to complement the inspection, our inspection work. We're often described as topping and tailing inspection activities. So what we do is some inspection planning around, as CJ says, mainly pressure vessels, pipework and pipelines. Once an inspection has been completed, we also get involved to do some advanced data analysis and some statistical evaluation of the data. So in terms of the talk today, I'm just going to start with a brief summary of what happens in terms of traditional pipework inspection and the analysis that goes along with that, how that can be impacted by measurement error. Move on to what we do in terms of the analysis we perform on the older data, and how that feeds into the planning phase for an upcoming inspection. I've got a case study by way of an example, then move on to how that's underpinned by the software that we developed specifically for this activity, and then finally go into how that all links into our digital twin capability. Before I move on, I'm aware I do have a habit of talking quite quickly, so if I start to go too fast, please shout and tell me to slow down. But as I say, so beginning with an overview of pipework inspection and what happens in traditional settings. So it's mainly used extensively of manual UT and radiography. So someone will go out and take a spot reading at a predefined inspection location. This is then recorded in a database along with all the other readings that's ever been taken on the specific component at that same location. And then there's some analysis subsequently performed on these readings. Generally quite limited analysis, but I will come to that slightly later on, I think. This does amount to quite low coverage. In some cases, it's as low as 1% inspection coverage for the pipework circuit, for example. Now, while that is quite an acceptable strategy if you've got predictable or extensive corrosion within the circuit, that can be problematic if you've got random or localized corrosion, because you're very unlikely to find it just based on that sort of very rigorous fixed approach. Coupled with that, these 2 points are largely go hand in hand. So if there's any issues, for example, at a particular location, it tends to be generally actions are taken on a per location basis. And only what I've called here panic readings are acted upon. What I mean by that is, for example, if the reading is taken at a specific location that's seen quite a noticeable drop in thickness reading since the previous inspection, then that tends to be focused on and acted upon in isolation. There's, from what we see at least, it's not often sort of fed back into more planning, not fed back into the planning phase to take account of other locations that could be seeing similar service to that, for example, which may need additional focus in the future. But however, that strategy does, in essence, become statistical sampling, because what you're doing is taking a distribution of thicknesses in order to try and predict your overall behavior. However, what is missing from what we see at least is an evaluation feedback loop to consider the inspection, both in terms of what has gone before and what you're expecting to find going forward. So in other words, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is we try to use what you know as an input to future campaigns. So in other words, use what you know to try and guide what you expect to find in the future. I mentioned this may be impacted by measurement error, and what I mean by that is because the analysis on spot readings that we see is generally amounts to a corrosion rate calculation, which is just the difference between the two readings divided by the time in which those two readings were taken. That can be heavily influenced by measurement error for several reasons. One is location, and that image on the right is my attempt to describe what the impact of location can have between multiple inspections. So the point is, if you've got a pit, for example, in your first inspection, you measure it accurately, and in the second one, you get the exact same location, measure that same pit, and it has a go, and then you will get a representative corrosion rate calculation at that location. If, however, you either miss it completely and catch it the second time, or partially catch it on the first and second inspections, then you're not going to get a true reflection on corrosion rate at that location, which can lead to incorrect decisions being taken. Also, the technique deployed can have an impact. So, for example, the probability of detection of ultrasonic techniques can vary, or it does vary from one technique to the other, and also the applicability of the technique versus what corrosion is being expected to be in place. Because again, the shape and the sort of I guess just shapes, form of a description, the shape of any corroded feature can have an impact on which techniques are most likely to find it and measure it accurately. I suppose is the point to make there. And finally, when it comes to the actual just collection of the data, so data entry can also have an impact on how on measurement error. Two examples here. So simple just data transposition. So for example, a reading which should be 22.3 has been incorrectly entered as 2.23 millimeters, which obviously is way too low. And my very technical term of fat fingers. So again, it's just a very easy mistake that everybody makes. You've pressed two buttons by accident. So for example, a reading that should be 45.6 millimeters has been incorrectly entered as 55.6. And again, some easy things that everybody does, which could have a significant bearing on integrity-related decisions. So what we do as a company, we first of all try to understand the overall corrosion behavior and deliver an analysis based on that. It's probably easier to explain as I go forward, so we'll come back to that in a slide to explain in more detail what I mean by that. But what we do is we start with an overview of the whole inspection history and then sort of drill down. You'll see later, but what we do is we just start looking at the overall trend of inspection data and then start looking at individual groupings within that data that are behaving in a similar way in order to start to make good or better decisions based on similar behavior within your sample set. So there's sort of four differentiators with that compared to the traditional approaches, I'm calling it. First of all, the recognition of sampling from a distribution that I mentioned earlier. Also, the response to measurement error. I'll cover how that's mitigated against as far as possible, at least on a later slide. We also utilize an integrity group-based corrosion rate and also corrosion coverage information. And again, I'll cover that with examples slightly later. And then finally, as I said, the aim is really just to improve efficiency and effectiveness of the whole inspection cycle. Essentially just making better use of resources as a whole. The other thing that needs to be considered is how corrosion is behaving spatially, which is something else we see that isn't often considered in terms of certainly pipework inspection. So it may not look like it, but all these images here have the same minimum value, but they look incredibly different. The point being is, depending on how your corrosion is behaving, will have a significant impact on your inspection strategy. Because if you take the top image, for example, it's very heavily corroded, it's very extensive, and it's very uniform. So if you take a small sample from that section, from that particular piece, will give you a lot of information on exactly what the behavior overall is. However, when you compare that to the bottom image, there's one single isolated pit, and a low coverage approach in that is, there's a good chance you're going to miss that pit if you just take a small sample. So as I say, it's something else that needs to be built into and reflected within the inspection strategy. So what we do initially is we start with box plots, which gives an overall inspection history in one view. For those that don't know, a box plot is just a way of visualizing data set as a whole. So this on the x-axis here is inspection year, and then the y-axis is a normalized value. The normalized value is the inspection result divided by the nominal thickness in order to allow various schedules of pipe to be compared initially in one go, essentially. The reason for that is often within a pipework circuit, you can get multiple diameters, multiple thicknesses, all within the same circuit. So in order to compare them on a like-for-like basis, we normalize, as I say, by dividing the minimum reading by nominal thickness to achieve the best comparison. Each box ranges from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile. So the base is the 25th, the top is the 75th percentile of the data, as is mentioned here. It's not particularly easy to see on these plots, but there is a slightly darker line within each, which reflects the median value too. These extensions on the end of the black lines, which people often call whiskers, are the spread from the 5th to the 95th percentile of the data. Then any dots are outliers beyond those limits. In addition to on this slide and all subsequent images where you see these things, there's two additional lines. One is a green dashed line at the nominal wall thickness. So that's 1 when you're normalizing by the wall, by normalizing by that value, because any nominal reading divided by itself is obviously going to be 1. And there's also a line at 0.875, which represents nominal wall thickness minus 12.5%, which is the sort of accepted manufacturing variation on pipework at least. Excuse me. So the reason we do this is because box plots is a very good way of giving an initial overview of long-term trends. So the image on the right here shows a circuit where there's been multiple inspections ranging from 1997 up to 2015 in this case, but it's very largely stable. There's been minor variation in the overall value, but there's no evidence of a downward trend here. Nothing that would be significantly concerning if we were to see that, certainly on a standalone basis at least. Whereas if you compare that to this next image, so there is more of a downward trend, particularly between these two inspection years. So there's a sort of downward, there's been a reduction in thickness values here, which has then remained largely stable. So that could be evidence of increased corrosion activity that we would look to investigate further. However, there is this final jump at the end here, this in thickness values. So that again would be something that would be looking to investigate further, because that could be replacement. It could just be repair. It could be that these readings were monitored for several years, but it was decided that there's no longer necessary. So as I say, it's the whole point is just to provide context in order to get an initial overview of exactly just what, in general terms, each pipework circuit is doing. This is an entry point. For the reasons I really just explained, to be perfectly honest. It raises questions based on the knowledge of circuit. So in other words, we would just look, as I say, just give a very general quick initial overview of what we're seeing in terms of general behavior before we would then look to take that insight to look at the groupings of various data points to gather everything that's behaving in a like manner together. That could be based on materials parameters, could be based on feature types, straights, bends, etc. It could be based on process groupings. Diameter is another one very common. Our starting point of this analysis, we always have we've got a rigorous, I suppose, procedure, for want of a better description, where we always look at as a first pass, we always look at the same types of groupings. So we take the initial one, we always eliminate dead legs, and we always focus in on straights initially, because it tends to be what sees the most corrosive activity. But then from there, we always then just take each data set as on its own merits, I suppose is the best way to describe that. And then start look into exactly what the behavior is. So I've just got an example here of grouping by diameter. So you can see each of these different, there's a value in the top of each of these individual plots to illustrate what the diameter is, and as I say, it just provides insights into what diameters could be seeing issues and which ones may not be. If you take, for example, the very small diameter stuff, 0.75, there's very stable behavior here, nothing obvious going on. Whereas if you compare that to stuff, the readings from the 20th inch diameter pieces, there's a downward trend towards the end of this, at the very least. And then the 6 inch diameter material, there's quite a lot of variation through all of these points again, which we need additional investigation. Another example here, there's just here would just be grouped by feature type. So again, bend, cap, reducer, angle straight, horizontal straight. So there's various different just acronyms, for a better word, to illustrate each type of feature. And again, it just gives a good overview of exactly what's behaving in what manner. You see here the horizontal straights have seen quite a noticeable drop and relatively stable, whereas reducers, which are thicker anyway, admittedly, are seeing more stability. And as I said, almost all of it is above the normal thickness, but that really comes from the manufacturing process of reducers, certainly. So I mentioned that group-based integrity corrosion rate. So how we produce our corrosion rates is we do trending based on each particular grouping that we identify as being of interest or of relevance, and we trend on the wall loss percentile values. So in other words, the nominal minus the difference between the minimum value and the normal thickness, we will trend on those. The reason for that is because looking at group trends and also taking a more long-term view, that does mitigate against measurement error that I mentioned earlier. It mitigates against it in the sense that we just accept that it will happen, because there's some things that you will never eliminate in terms of measurement error. So by taking a more long-term view and spreading that over the history and all the data that has been gathered, it will never eliminate the measurement error, but it will nullify it as far as possible. Reason being, it does allow us to make more accurate short and long-term corrosion rate calculations. However, we can also just take a consideration of individual points. I mentioned earlier that some points may see a noticeable drop in thickness for whatever reason. So that also can be built into the analysis. We can just isolate a single point and, if necessary, do trending based on the behavior at that single point rather than a group-based activity to predict when, for example, an alarm limit such as minimum allowable wall thickness could be reached. That may allow you to build in a more better plan placements and repairs, I suppose is the best way to describe what I'm trying to say there, with a view to having more targeted and more efficient inspections using the data that you have at your disposal. So I have an example here of our the plots that we would use to produce this corrosion rate. So there's histograms on the right hand side, and there's trends based on the wall loss values here. So these are very easy to turn on and off in our software. We can just multi-select whichever years we choose to. So, and the color coding shows which years are being used to produce the short-term rate, which in this case is 0.49 millimeters per year, and the long-term rate, which is 0.08. You may notice that we haven't used the most recent inspection cycle for this one. The reason for that was because this was just the two most representative inspection years for this particular grouping that we used. But as this is again, it's very much a case-by-case and individual basis for calculating these types of things. We can also use, we could go back further if we chose to. In this case, we were asked not to go beyond, well, go back earlier than 2006 for the purpose of this calculations. But as I say, we could trend across the whole inspections history if we needed to. The image on the left is related to that. So what we have here are linear normal probability plots of each inspection year that's just been selected for use within the corrosion rate calculation. And the reason for that is just to show a trend on the individual data points. The fact that they're moving to the right hand side, it shows that wall loss is increasing, and therefore it's just an overall more general overview of the behavior of the circuit, and that it is actually corroding. It's not shown in this particular slide, but the shape of these probability plots can also give some kind of insight into the type of corrosion that's active within each grouping, if there is any. Because these are all very straight, however, ones that are shown a more curved shape would be more indicative of something quite localized going on, whereas these are very, very linear and very straight. So that's something more general is happening here. It would be what this is telling you. Obviously, there's more to it and more investigation required than that, but it's a very good, quick and easy way of at least getting deriving more information from data that has been previously gathered. So Our analysis phase is in effect phase 1, and that then feeds into the inspection planning phase, which is phase 2. I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail because one, it'll take far too long. It's a whole presentation itself, to be perfectly honest. And yeah, it's frankly some of it's proprietary. But as I say, as a general overview, so first of all we consider several factors in terms of what the information is telling us of what has gone before. So the general state of the material at the previous inspection. So are the results showing that they're largely stable? Has there been a major downward trend, for example? We also take into account relevant groupings from the analysis phase, and also build into to consider applicable degradation threats from a corrosion risk assessment, the CRA. So in other words, how predictable is the identified mechanisms that are of legitimate concern? How severe would they be if they were to become active, and how any mechanism would develop spatially if it were to become active? And that relates to the slide I was showing earlier, in that would it be very localized, for example, or would it be more general and quite uniform in terms of how it would propagate spatially if it were to become an issue? There's a lot of information here on these next couple of slides. I'm really just describing what we do, and it's probably best illustrated within my case study example, but I thought best just to go through it anyway. So we first of all start by defining a corrosion state. In other words, what we would expect to find. So if there's no evidence of corrosion in the circuit, then we would hope to continue not to find anything. However, if there's something, if there is corroded material, then again we would look to better quantify that, certainly. So if necessary, we can define a corrosion coverage from previous results. That's, in other words, just the extent of the corroded material that has been seen previously, and that has an impact on the choice of corrosion coverage. We also define any thresholds of concern based on historic results, and that is relative to the normalized wall thickness. So, for example, if a pipework circuit has seen no evidence of degradation in the past, then a threshold of concern would be somewhere around normal thickness, and the specific choice would be driven by exactly what the circuit was telling us, but that's, in general terms, that's what we'd be looking at. We'll also look to consider points flagged as under or over inspected and determine if there's any reason for that. Sometimes there are legitimate reasons for certain being locations being under inspected access, for example, or if a point has seen a lot of inspection in the past, we could also identify if there is a reason for that. I mentioned this last point earlier to an extent. So the expected corrosion mechanisms does have a bearing on the choice of technique. So in terms of the detection threshold and the probability of detection, the PLD for each technique does vary depending on what exactly you're looking for. So that's also something we would look to consider. So any relevant corrosion mechanism identified within the risk assessment would be taken account of in terms of best informing what the right technique to deploy would be. So we would take our threshold in the corrosion state, which were defined as I mentioned before, and we would then calculate the proportion of historic results before the threshold using this ratio I've got shown here. It's very simple. So just take whatever, so if our threshold is normal thickness, for example, however many points we saw below that threshold historically, it's divided by the total number of points that have been inspected would be our ratio. And we've got some algorithms and some code to calculate the minimum amount of inspection increments that would be expected to find points below this threshold. This is one example of this. We generally do this as an order of magnitude calculation. So for example, if in general terms, if the circuit has seen approximately 100 inspection increments, the various lines are varying levels of corrosion coverage. So for example, if you've got 50% corrosion coverage, then you're going to need a very number of low inspections in order to have a very high probability of identifying something of concern if it were there. Whereas if you got a much lower level at 1%, then you would see, you'd be looking to do more inspections to have you at the same confidence that you would identify, or at least the same probability at least that you would identify a point, the appropriate number of points below that threshold. There is also an evaluation phase that we use because I say really just to assess if our predictions were correct, to be perfectly honest. So in other words, did the inspection reflect what we expected to find? So we would use our ratio again, use the same ratio as previously to determine what if the anticipated findings reflected reality. So we would just, for example, just jump back a slide. So this is the historic number of historic points below a threshold. We would then take the previous, the most recent inspection and determine the number of points that were really below that threshold and compare the two. If they were broadly similar, approximately the same, then you can say that apologies. Then you can say that the finding reflected reality. However, if there was a marked difference in either one of them, then that would need to be considered either immediately in order to go back and do some more inspection to determine something, if the extent of corrosion, if it was found and if it was found and was unexpected, or similarly, if we perhaps were expecting to find corrosion in a certain area and didn't find it, that could also be built into inspection planning going forwards. So in order to perform this analysis, we have developed a software called SPIDERS. It stands for Automatic Pipework Database Analysis and Reporting Software. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but we seem to fit the acronym quite well. The point is we can accommodate many data formats from that. Predominantly, the historic readings are given to us in the form of Excel sheets mainly, but we can also, there's various other data formats that we can upload into our reporting, so into the analysis software for our database. The data is also screened and upload for any spurious points. It will come out as a flag. So if a single point is showing a significant difference from all the other points around it, then that will be flagged to say this point may well be spurious, and it can either be, or it would be investigated by the operator at that point, and would either be quarantined or would be included depending on whether or not the point was considered to be, the reading was considered to be genuine. There is an automated and electronic reporting format, reporting function, I should say, built into the software. As we go through, we can populate various, and produce our graphs. We can also link comments and descriptions to those. And there's a push button option which will spit out an electronic report to detail the analysis. So we also upload new inspection data as it's provided. It's very easy to add new points to an existing database, and the point is really just that for further refining the analysis. This does link to our mini digital twin, and I'll cover that in more detail a little bit later. But this is one image taken from an aspect of the mini digital twin. By way of a preview, spoiler, whatever you call it. But before I get to that, I'll just go over a case study quickly, or to illustrate the methodology in a little bit more detail. So for one client, we provided a huge amount of inspection data. We got almost 6,500 Excel workbooks with historic readings. That amounted to just under 22,500 Excel individual sheets. I can't remember the exact number of data points, but it was hundreds of thousands of data points that were contained within these Excel sheets and workbooks. We did some data mining of unstructured data. Some of it didn't have the information associated with it that should have, so we did some mining to fix that essentially. We also reviewed the data to make choices on the optimal method for this particular client and how to best implement our methodology for them. Data in a similar format, not identical. What I mean by that last bullet point is that when we were given the data, a lot of it was all said the same thing, but was presented in slightly different ways. For example, some reports were given in a Word format, others were in PDF. So we had to do a little bit of work in order to wrangle all the reports and readings into a single readable format so that it could be uploaded into our database. So I'll just go through one example from this. A lot of these slides are redacted just for the purposes of confidentiality. But so this initial plot, I should say, it just shows all points associated with a particular pipework circuit from this one client. You can see in general terms, very, very stable, nothing of significant concern across the whole, of course, every year between 2001 and 2019. But in 2020, there's only 2 inspection points. One was approximately normal, and then another one was significantly lower. So that is something that we would look to investigate to find out exactly what the reason for that was. This one obviously wasn't excluded based on the. This one would have been flagged in the initial uploading into our database, and it was deemed that it couldn't be definitively said to be spurious. So we left it in order to investigate a little bit further. So I mentioned earlier that we go through, certainly in the initial phases of the analysis, we go through quite a well-defined structure or process in terms of what initial groupings we would and wouldn't consider. So first of all, as I said, we do look at the dead leg versus non-dead leg data in terms of pipework. So this image here shows all the non-dead leg data and and you can see that the lowest value on the y-axis is 1. So therefore, everything is in or around nominal thickness, and there's nothing of major significant concern happening within the non-dead leg data. However, if you compare that to the dead leg data, you'll see this is where this unusually low point is coming from, and there's a couple of other sort of outliers which are a little bit below normal, but not significantly so. So in order to plan the inspection for this particular circuit, we looked at the predicted corrosion coverage using cumulative thickness distributions, which are plotted using the normalized thickness data. And for those that don't know, a cumulative thickness distribution is just a way of visualizing a data set. It's plotted on a logarithmic scale. So this is, for example, 110, 1. So 100% of your data points are up here, and then this is 10%, and this is 1%. So it's a very good way of visualizing any differences in behavior within a data set. It's also how the curve behaved in terms of changes in shape or kinks in the curve is also a very good indicator of whether or not corroded material is present. So this curve on the left, which comes from the non-dead leg data, is a very classic normal, as normal as you can get really, in terms of thickness data at least. It's a smooth reducing trend on this, so there's not really any evidence of corrosion within this sample, although it's quite blocky, but it just comes from the nature of the data in this particular instance. However, when you compare it to the curve on the right, which is the dead leg data, it starts off and then very quickly there's this change in shape. This doesn't follow a normal smooth reducing trend. There's a noticeable kink here and it kicks off and goes somewhere else. So that is very classic example of corrosion within a cumulative thickness distribution curve at the very least. So in terms of how we implemented our methodology in terms of inspection planning for this one circuit, so given that the non-dead leg data was showing very general stability, we wanted to confirm the absence of corrosion there. So in other words, we would be concerned if there were a significant increase to any proportion of points significantly below the nominal thickness. So we set a threshold of 0.97 of nominal for the non-dead leg data. Given the corrosion risk assessment, there was the morphology of the corrosion that would be most likely would be very localized if it was present. So that was just, as I said, that was just based on the risk assessment and the highest rank threat within that assessment. So our corrosion rate that we calculated on the non-dead leg data was, on the non-dead leg data was 0.03 millimeters per year. However, it was significantly higher rate on the dead legs, given the single point what did transpire to be genuine that had to be looked at going forward. So based on the various considerations, we recommended an inspection coverage of 15%. Excuse me, with a particular recommendation to focus on one line in particular, for two reasons. One, I had the point of concern, and two, actually the number of points that were present, inspection points present on that one line within the circuit accounted for 45% of all locations within that circuit, but it had not seen relative levels of inspection in the past. So for the 45% of that accounted for the inspection points in the circuit as a whole, it had only seen approximately 5% level of inspection, which obviously there's a disparity there which needs to be considered. So moving on to how this fits into our digital twin. So just a bit of background for anyone who doesn't know. So a digital twin is a digital replica of a real world component used for multiple factors. You can be used for simulations for various reasons, can be used for testing of various things. For us, we use it for really just as a means of aiding access and visualization of information. Within the oil and gas industry, that from what we see, it amounts to either representation of something quite large, such as a platform or refinery. You could then go into more individual things such as pipework circuits, which can be still, depending on how many lines and how long they are, can still be quite large, or something, yes, again, they do vary hugely in size, but something single like a pressure vessel can also be considered within digital twin environment. We mainly focus on the last two, pipework and pressure vessels, but we can build something up to platform if required. We see that the big selling point of them is it's a very easy, quick, easy way to share information and visualization of information and data with multiple stakeholders. We have had comments from a number of clients saying that often their frustration is that they have to present things to people who are non-technical, and if they had something where everything was very well contained and easy, just to almost like a click button. Excuse me, things can be called up the click of a button and easily shown and easily visualized. It's much easier. They found it much easier to explain to stakeholders within their organization rather than trying to flick through the ports, for example. So small disclaimer at the front. I only have screenshots just because it's easier than arranging a software demo. So live software demos are always fraught with danger. But I can arrange a demo for anyone who's interested, but it'd be more appropriate to come from our the lead software developer, who's called Robert Cumming. But as I say, I can certainly arrange anything for people who are interested. There's a GIF on the right-hand side that just scrolls through a number of things that we can house within a digital twin. A lot of the examples on here are pressure vessels, just because what we use as an example, because it's much easier to visualize in terms of just giving an overview rather than a section of pipework that we find. But as I say, so there is a tree format to ease navigation. We can, which is shown on the right here. So excuse me, shown on the left of this GIF. So we can house any number of things within the digital twin. So reports, inspection scopes, any data. You'll see thickness maps, for example, on the pressure vessel as it goes through. We can also include any photographs, diagrams, for example, a GA or a PNID drawing, or really, I say much more, but frankly, anything that you have that we can get access to, we can certainly include within the structure. As I say, it's just all done in a tree format, and it's just the click of a button, and you will just get the whatever within this category. You will just get the various different documents or data files that are associated with that component, and you can quite easily call them up and read them in more detail. And as I will cover some of this a little more detail as I go through. So we start at a site level and then move down on a component or a circuit basis. So you can see on this is site one. This is just being created for the sake of an example. So if you go site one, a number of vessels and pipework circuits, vessel EPC. So within here, there's a data sheet, there's a digital twin, there's a GA, homepage, PNIG, which is yeah, just for the purposes, again, for an example, just something we could include a dashboard, essentially, so you can think of that. There's some inspection data embedded within here and images from a particular strake. The models are created when needed. So in other words, we wouldn't do this blanketly for every application. We would only want to do it when someone actually wanted or felt it necessary. Obviously, when we're building a digital twin, we do need to build the model. But my point is, we wouldn't implement it willy-nilly, I suppose. We also can have interactive access to inspection data. So again, this is straight from pressure vessel, just because, as I say, I find it's an easier example to visualize and to show, because you can show more data here than anything else. So we can show the inspection data, we can show statistical distribution, we can perform some additional evaluation within that. Levels of access, what I mean is we could say, for example, we could have someone who was qualified to could go in and process or look at inspection data if they were needed to or if they wanted to. However, someone who just wanted to get an overall overview of the particular component would have different access requirements, different access privileges. They couldn't then go in and amend stuff that they shouldn't be, is perfectly honest. There's a pit modeling feature also within this, so we can focus on an area of concern for example, here, there's been two inspections performed in subsequent years on this particular asset component. So we can, as I say, we can focus on an individual area with a function that we call lassoing, and then draw a box around that. We then get the cumulative thickness distribution from that area, and also we can perform and produce, I should say, a profile view from a horizontal and vertical slice of this pit to get an idea of any changes that have happened between those two inspections. And in addition to that, we can also, in addition to the profile view, the pit modeling profile views, we can also visualize a 3D slice through the component of a single pit as well. This is also interactive, so you could rotate this if you wanted to. Obviously, this is a screenshot again, as I say, but within the actual software, we can rotate this, or the user can rotate this so they can best visualize any pits within their data. In terms of how that links to our pipework, so the tree format will be, which as I say, there's redactions here. There's circuits in here that obviously we can't show circuit names. So the spiders analysis will essentially link to the digital twin and will appear within the tree format again for just easing data access and data understanding. There are various other visualizations that we do on top of that, which I think that's either the next slide or subsequent slide I've got to show that in a little bit more detail. But as I say, this software will talks to each other, and the analysis that is performed can be pulled into here if necessary or if required, to be viewed alongside the other data with the data and information associated with that particular pipework circuit. So there's another GIF here, which is slightly different to the one I shown earlier. Just an example of how we would display information using our digital twin relative to the pipework. There are pressure vessels again within this particular GIF, but as you see the pipework come up, you'll see the type of information that we can show. So we show there. There'll be an image of a snapshot of the parameters of the particular circuit, so that'll show the diameter and the thickness, for instance. Also just coming up right now. There. So, and then the colorings, the various different colorings that are seen, as you are seeing as it flashes through, is so we're just displaying a various pieces of information about that particular circuit. So the time since last inspection, the number of times it has been inspected. We can also include the minimum thickness, which would just be colored on a grid basis. So each of these sections that changes color uniformly is an inspection location defined according to the inspection procedures of that particular client. And as I say, we're just coloring according to various different source information. So when it was last inspected, how many times it's been inspected, the group corrosion rate, wall loss at that particular level, that particular location. But as I say, that is just grouped or colored uniformly for that across the whole location. We can also include the normalized wall thickness. We could include grid data, so corrosion maps, for example. We could also superimpose that onto digital twin within this too. So, for example, when the pipework is shown here, we could include corrosion mapping data if it had been obtained within the digital twin as well. So how it's all housed, I suppose, is the point of this slide. So the inspection recommendations from our Spider software will be fed into this digital twin for the ease of issue. Data extrapolation can be done within digital twin if required, but also can be done within Spiders. But as I say, they talk to each other, so it's really it's user preference on who does what. But as I say, the point that I mentioned quite early on in the talk, that the point of doing an extrapolation on a single data point would be to flag when repair or maintenance may be required in order to better plan resources around that. The whole point, the whole crux of it is to aid in efficient inspection planning, to optimize resource allocation, to streamline costs. In other words, as I say, because you are using what you know to better inform what you expect to find, you can then make decisions on applying the right technique at the right location to maximize the data, the value of the data you can obtain, and make best use of resources in terms of people and equipment to make for efficiency purposes. I think that's all for me in this. Yes, so as I say, I hope that was informative. If there's any questions, I'm quite happy to take them. I hope it was, yeah, hope it was, I'll find it useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin, for a very, very wonderful and data-intensive presentation. Fortunately, we were able to bring it down to the level so those of us without that solid foundation in mathematics could still follow along. We are still expecting questions from the attendees, but we do have a couple to start off. So I'll take the first one, which is from our chairperson, Dr. Ijaz. He says, thanks for a very good presentation. And the question is, what would be the full list of extreme values in inspection data?
Sorry, what would be the
full list of extreme values in inspection data? For instance, low wall thickness, high corrosion rate, etc.
Just what would be the full list? Sorry, catch it.
The full list of extreme values, because I think in one of the slides you talked about extreme values.
Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean. To be honest, do you mean like, for example, flagging points that are low, or?
Yeah, sorry, can I jump in and if you allow me to question that? Sorry, you mentioned that there are some extreme values, the values that are not fitting in the curve. So those values, like say, for example, you mentioned the one that is the low point, which is way below the nominal minus tolerance. So you could actually grab that from this box plot.
Yes,
so that particular one. So I was wondering, can this box plot can find some other issues, something like high corrosion rates? And when you are talking about the percentiles in another slide, you were suggesting that you can actually fit in any data which is in between 25 to 75 percentile, and the error bars will grab the anything remaining inspection values. So can it capture anything like high corrosion rates? Anything relation to that?
Yes, I mean, any high corrosion rate would initially be reflected within a box plot. You would see it. I think there's a better example if I jump up earlier. So, for example, there would be a very high corrosion rate between these 2 points here, 2004 and 2005. If we just to consider them as two individual inspection years. So the corrosion rate is really the corrosion. Excuse me, I'll start again. Corrosion is illustrated by any downward trend within these box plots. We would use this as a basis to investigate points further, because when you start drilling down into this, corrosion rates could be even higher within these box plots. So that's why we would start look to identify groupings that are behaving in a similar manner in order to make a more accurate representation of the corrosion rate. Does that answer your question?
It does. Cheers. Thank you very much. Just before we go into the next question, Siji, can we please request all the audience to ask the question in QA tab? And if you cannot put your question in the QA tab, and if you're struggling with it, please raise your hand and we will allow you to speak, and you can actually ask your question straight away. If that's okay with everyone. Cheers. Thank you very much. Back to you, Siji.
Okay. So I do have a couple of questions here. Hopefully they are in sequence, but on the back of your explanation to Ijaz, I take it that there is a means within the analysis to exclude points which would relate to spool replacements and the likes.
Yes, yes, yeah. So as I say, let's just jump around. Just best to illustrate with this. So, if I take this example here, so this jump here could be a replacement in the manner you've described. So when we come to calculate a corrosion rate, when we take the data set as a whole, if we were to consider the previous one, a spool replacement would be reflected on this particular plot on the right hand side. So we could just choose to exclude that particular year from the purpose of the corrosion rate calculation. Yes.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Then most of the data you presented relates to where we can actually have a definable corrosion rate through measurements and inspection data.
Yeah.
Does the analysis lend itself to stuff which ordinarily is not trendable, like cracking on CRAs, for example?
Short answer, not really. This does rely on quite a significant volume of historic data in order to do a long-term trend. But certainly we could, if there was something quantitative, certainly we could look at that, yes. But as it stands, I don't think it would be tracking would be something that would be particularly
okay. Question from the audience. Unfortunately, the person's name is not here. It says anonymous attendee, but the question goes, if you're looking at normalized wall thickness, can you distinguish external from internal corrosion?
On a purely normalized wall thickness value basis, no. But there are within the database that we have got. So in the data that we haven't given thus far, there is always a flag on that as to whether it's internal or external degradation. I should have mentioned sort of earlier, everything in here is related to internal degradation. But yes, so in terms of, so we could split those out certainly in terms of an internal versus external wall thickness value, and that would just be a case of doing another grouping within our analysis in our software.
All right, thank you, Kevin. One more question from myself. Now, in the data sets that you've received, I take it that would there be any means of accounting for event-driven wall loss? For example, like you have erosion events on a flow line, which by itself would be production dependent and sporadic at best.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? So
I was saying that how would the analysis handle event-driven wall loss as against normal operational wall loss?
Okay, yeah. So so we would certainly be able to identify event-driven wall loss, which we could then investigate further to determine the root cause of that. Which when we come to produce the report on that, would certainly, because as we're performing analysis, as I mentioned, we can produce a plot and then just make some comments and discussion and tag it to that particular plot. So we could say, this has been flagged as wall loss. We investigate the cause, it was caused by erosion, for example, as you mentioned. So it would be raised within the report that's produced electronically.
All right, thank you, Kevin. We're still waiting for more questions from the audience, but before one comes, I'll just ask this quick question. Now, from what you've explained to us so far, the analysis for it to be really thorough requires on a volume of data. Yep. How do you handle instances when there is insufficient data? Say, for example, an asset has transferred ownership and they can't find all the historic inspection records, or they're just gaps.
We just have to work with what we've got, to be perfectly honest. Yes, I mean, for example, it's not going to be the most accurate trend. We still could trend, for example, between 2 years. It would be broadly similar to what, as I mentioned, the analysis would be done sort of ordinarily. So just by taking the difference between two readings and the time between that, the time taken between those two readings. However, because we would hopefully have more data points, even just from a circuit level. So, for example, rather than comparing just one individual point across a time frame, we would be comparing multiple points within the same 2 years. So you would still, you would hope at the very least, have slightly more to go on rather than just the difference between two individual thickness readings.
Okay, well, it's not like as if you have typical data fits for types of equipment, like for vessels as against loss and heat exchangers against loss and pipework circuits.
No, this analysis here is primarily aimed at pipework circuits. What we would do with pressure vessels would be slightly different. We would just look to do a more in-depth data comparison using the thickness distributions that I've shown. But that's, again, that's a whole other topic. But this particular approach is really just focused on pipework data. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Question from our audience from Haken, pardon my pronunciation, Anfeld. And the question goes, how do you handle the difference in measurement uncertainties and probability of detection for different NDT techniques?
We just make a judgment based on the the applicability of that technique versus the corrosion mechanism of concern. So we would look to just make a judgment or an assessment on the trial data available for that particular technique to look at how suitable it would be for the mechanism of concern.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. And on the back of that, let me ask this question. So when it comes to determining the coverage for the inspection planning, there was a slide in which you mentioned, for example, a 15% inspection coverage. But would that be 15% of all test points available, or just the test points of interest, the susceptible locations?
On that particular one, it was of all test points available, because that's what the operator that was how their cycle worked essentially. But it could be either, to be perfectly honest. We could work either one.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Any more questions from the audience on this quite interesting topic? Okay, while we're waiting for more questions, I'll ask my last one for the evening, hopefully. Now, you have mentioned cumulative thickness a couple of times in your presentation. Yep. What is the concept of cumulative thickness? I mean, what exactly does it mean?
It's really just how it's a representation of all thickness values within a single inspection map or a component. If I will stop sharing my screen briefly, and I will try and find an example to show you. But the point of it is to it's a visualization of all thickness readings from a single. It could be from a strake of a pressure vessel. It could be from a pressure vessel as a whole. Excuse me. So if I share my screen again, this is actually from a training slide set for new starts. But so if you take, for example, a corrosion map or multiple corrosion maps, you then plot all the data points using a cumulative thickness distribution. So that will just basically it sorts all the points and then place them on a logarithmic scale. So if this, for example, was to be a strake of a pressure vessel, so you can see there's approximately. So this as I say, this goes up in a factor of 10. If I start, sorry, I'm not in presentation mode. So this is 10% of the data, and this is 20% in the next line up. So approximately, say 17–18% of the data in this particular region was measured at 121.5 millimeters or less. If you jump down slightly further, 1% of data was, let's say, 120.7 millimeters or less. So it's really just as I say, a way of visualizing the proportion of data points at the range of thicknesses within an inspection data set.
So indication of the spread of the data. Yeah.
So as I said, the proportion of each point. So for example, I'd say that this represents 1% of data. So 1% of the data is at this value or less. And plotting it in this manner, also, as I say, also does give an overview into what the behavior is in terms of corrosion activity. So this is a largely normal curve because there's a sort of minor sort of deviation there, but in general terms, there's a very smooth shape to this. So that's not indicative of corrosion. However, if you compare it to the next one, this is a very noticeable break here. So this is the point at which corroded material is starting to be sort of make itself known within this particular data set. So the break in this curve here is at 13.1 millimeters and affecting 22% of the inspection area. So in other words, 22% of this data set is affected by corrosion. Is what this curve is showing.
All right, thank you, Kevin. We have 4 questions from the audience. I'll take the first one from Ravi Shankar Siriki. And the question is it possible to define corrosion classification like HIC or stress corrosion cracking, etc.?
Within the analysis, to define individual mechanisms, no. It would give insights into what types of mechanisms it could be in terms of how they were behaving. So the shape, as I said, I'm not sharing my screen again. Apologies.
Okay, thank you, Kevin.
yeah, so the shape of I mentioned the normal probability plot. Where are we? This one. So the shape of this could give insight into what types of corrosion are present, at least in terms of how they're behaving. So it would narrow down the field in terms of what mechanisms in place. But for a specific mechanism, no, we wouldn't be able to make it just on the basis of this alone. No,
Oh, thank you. I'll go. Thank you, Kevin. Right, another question from one of our attendees. Are you more concerned with false positives or false negatives when determining feature or lines with diverging behavior? And what steps do you take to avoid either?
I don't want either, to be perfectly honest. I wouldn't say I'm not more concerned one or the other. To be frank, and what steps do we take? As I say, as the data being screened and uploaded is the one sort of significant one, so we can very quickly identify anything that could fall into one of those categories, to investigate further. If there's not, if it can't be definitively ruled out on an initial first pass based on the being flagged by the algorithm, then we can dig into the data more in terms of the groupings to determine what points could and should be quarantined from the overall analysis to best inform the corrosion rate calculation.
Just like in the case study where you had that outlier which required it for the investigation at the end of the day.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. One more question from the audience. What if dead legs are not identified or the information is not provided? How does the software pick up on nonlinear damage mechanisms?
I mean, that dead leg almost just happened to be an example. Sorry, on that particular example, the fact that it was in a dead leg is coincidence, to be perfectly honest. It just happened to be caught. The non-linear degradation there would have been found one way or the other because it would fall into some grouping. It just so happened that it was in the dead legs in this instance. In terms of what groupings we can apply, whatever's been flagged within the data set that we provided, we can group on that basis. So if there was no dead leg sort of identifier, then we wouldn't be able to do that unless we went through individually and did it ourselves, which we could do. It would just take a bit of time. But any non-linear degradation mechanism, if it wasn't flagged, captured under sort of dead leg category, would fall into one of the other ones, and we would group accordingly on that basis.
All right, thank you, Kevin. And then our last question from the audience for tonight, and the question is, would your software give us the most useful numbers we're interested in? For example, long-term corrosion rate and short-term corrosion rate.
Short answer is yes, but it depends how. So we will calculate short-term and long-term corrosion rates based on the two factors. One, the most comparable years in terms of inspection points and locations, and two, just the overall sort of time span. So as I say, depending on how far back you wish to go, this what happens on the slide. So the long-term rate of this instance is covering inspection years from 2006 to 2013 in this particular example. However, we could go back further beyond that to define a longer term corrosion rate. And similarly, we could also within any data set, we can also very quickly and easily just include or exclude different years to produce a short term rate.
Okay, but I take it that there's also some dependency on the feedback received from the client. For example, if there was a change in process, say, for example, the production characteristics changed, and as such, maybe at the onset of the data acquisition, they were looking at not so much in terms of internal degradation, but then maybe a change in production water cut could then account for increased degradation, which they may want to focus on.
Yeah, certainly. We have seen instances in the past and produced reports where there was a marked increase in the corrosion rate, which coincided with a spike in water cut, and again an increase in water cut. So we were able to put that context alongside the readings and just focus the corrosion rate just on the time sort of pre-increased water cut and post-increased water cut, if that makes sense.
Sure. Thank you so very much, Kevin, for a lovely presentation. I am sure the audience enjoyed it as much as we did. And I would just like to thank the audience for attending. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, and thanks to Sonomatic for their time and your time in attending tonight. Our next event would be the Marine Corrosion Forum. The date is to be advised on the website and through our mailing list. If you're not currently on our mailing list, drop us a line and we'll definitely get you included. And just to say good night, everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.